What if the person sitting next to you, quietly sipping their tea, was actually plotting your death? This chilling scenario played out for the unsuspecting victims of Graham Young, known as the teacup poisoner. For years, Young hid behind the facade of a normal office worker, secretly poisoning dozens of colleagues, leaving them unaware of the danger in their cups. His choice of weapon was deceptively simple: thallium, a deadly poison hidden in tea. But what drove a seemingly ordinary man to commit such horrific acts? Join us as we unravel the terrifying story of this notorious murderer. Graham Young's fascination with poisons began at a surprisingly young age. Unlike many children who are captivated by the wonders of science or nature, Graham was drawn to the more dangerous side of chemistry, the deadly world of poisons. At first, this interest seemed harmless enough. However, what began as a curiosity about chemicals quickly turned into an obsession with the power they held over life and death. From a young age, Graham displayed signs of an unhealthy preoccupation with death. Rather than experimenting with traditional scientific concepts, he was obsessed with concocting toxic substances. He studied the effects of various poisons on animals and found enjoyment in watching them suffer and die. What seemed like an innocent interest in chemistry was, in reality, an early sign of a deeply disturbed individual. His fascination with poisons was not driven by a thirst for knowledge, but by an unsettling desire to control life itself. This early obsession set the stage for the shocking events that would follow. By the age of 13, Graham had already begun experimenting with poisons on his family. The first victim of his experiments was his own stepmother, Molly, whom he poisoned with thallium. The slow and painful symptoms of poisoning left her bedridden, yet no one suspected that it was Graham who had caused her suffering. Instead, it was dismissed as a mysterious illness, which only fueled his sense of power and control over the lives of others. Psychologically, Graham's behavior was indicative of a deeper, darker issue. His lack of empathy for the suffering of others, combined with his fascination with death, pointed to the development of a psychopathic personality. He lacked the ability to connect with people emotionally, viewing them more as subjects for his experiments than as human beings. This emotional detachment was a key characteristic that would define his actions later in life. As Graham's obsession with poisons grew, so did the danger he posed to those around him. The foundation for his eventual killing spree had been laid in his childhood, and the steps that would lead him to become one of Britain's most notorious serial killers were already in motion. At just 13 years old, Graham Young took his dark curiosity to the next level, poisoning his stepmother, Molly, with thallium. The effects of the poison on his grandmother, the first victim, were slow and insidious. Molly's health deteriorated over time, with symptoms that baffled doctors. She experienced extreme fatigue, hair loss, and nausea, yet the cause was elusive. Graham, however, knew exactly what was happening. This wasn't an accidental event. It was a deliberate experiment. His stepmother's suffering fascinated him, and instead of feeling guilt, he felt a sense of power. He had taken control of someone's life in a way that only a true psychopath could. But poisoning his stepmother wasn't enough for Graham. The chilling escalation of his actions came when he turned his attention to a neighbor's child. For Graham, the true thrill lay in the ability to cause suffering and death without being detected. The child's illness, just like Molly's, went misdiagnosed at first. But the pattern was becoming clearer. Graham was deliberately poisoning those around him, using the same lethal substance he had experimented with before. This wasn't an isolated incident or a random act. It was part of his growing obsession. What made Graham's crimes even more disturbing was how coldly he approached them. He wasn't just a troubled teenager acting out. He was a young boy who had found a disturbing sense of pleasure in watching others suffer. The emotional detachment Graham displayed was alarming. Instead of seeing his victims as real people with families and lives of their own, he saw them as test subjects, objects for his experiments. This lack of empathy would later become a hallmark of his behavior, and it was what made him so dangerous. At the age of 14, Graham's deadly obsession with poisons finally led to his undoing. The neighbor's child's poisoning caught the attention of authorities, and suspicions about Graham's role in the incidents began to surface. Police soon uncovered traces of thallium and other toxic substances in his room. They discovered that Graham had been systematically poisoning those around him, including his family. The pattern was too clear to ignore. Graham was arrested, and the investigation revealed the chilling extent of his crimes. His disturbing fascination with poisons and his lack of remorse raised serious questions about his psychological state. Was he simply a misguided child, or was he a dangerous psychopath in the making? His arrest marked the beginning of a deep dive into his psyche, and experts soon realized that Graham was not just a troubled teen. He was a killer in the making. After Graham Young's arrest, he was sent to Broadmoor Psychiatric Hospital, a high-security institution for individuals deemed criminally insane. At the age of 14, Graham's case was shocking, not just for the crimes he committed, but for his complete lack of remorse. The psychiatrist's initial assessments of him were deeply concerning. Graham was diagnosed with several psychiatric disorders, including an obsession with poisons, which seemed to consume his every thought. For Graham, poisoning was not merely an act of violence. It was a calculated experiment, a way to control others, and it thrilled him in a way that nothing else could. His condition was more than an ordinary fascination. It was a pathological need to test his power over life and death. As Graham spent his teenage years at Broadmoor, the true extent of his dangerous obsession became more apparent. He didn't appear to respond to the treatment offered by the hospital's psychiatric staff. Instead of expressing guilt or remorse for the lives he had harmed, Graham showed signs of enjoyment in recounting his poisonings. His time at Broadmoor did little to alter his mindset. If anything, it seemed to amplify his belief that he was different from others. He viewed his confinement not as punishment, but as a temporary setback. The hospital's psychiatric reports noted that Graham's personality was cold, calculated, and detached, with little to no emotional connection to his victims or the suffering he caused. His ability to mask his true nature and manipulate those around him raised alarms, but it wasn't enough to keep him behind bars. Despite his dangerous tendencies, Graham was granted an early release from Broadmoor at the age of 23. The decision to release him was a deeply controversial one, as his psychiatric evaluation had indicated he posed a high risk to the public. But in the 1960s, there was still a prevailing belief in the rehabilitation of individuals with mental health issues. The authorities deemed Graham safe enough to return to society, despite his history of poisonings and lack of emotional connection to his actions. This decision would prove disastrous. Graham was released into the community, and despite having spent years in psychiatric care, his obsession with poisons never waned. If anything, it had grown stronger. The system's failure to fully understand the depths of Graham's psychopathy, combined with their willingness to believe that psychiatric treatment could cure him, set the stage for the second, far more lethal chapter of his life. Graham returned to society and immediately began plotting his next steps, seemingly undeterred by the consequences of his actions in the past. He quickly found a job as a clerk in various offices, and it wasn't long before he started poisoning people again, this time in a more calculated and widespread manner. What's most chilling about Graham's time in Broadmoor is how little he seemed to change during his stay. His case would go on to serve as a stark warning about the dangers of underestimating individuals who commit violent crimes without showing the typical signs of remorse. The failure of the psychiatric system to properly assess Graham's ongoing threat allowed him to reintegrate into society, where he would continue his poisoning spree, leaving a trail of victims in his wake. His release ultimately sealed the fate of many innocent people who would fall victim to his calculated experiments. Upon his release from Broadmoor, Graham Young moved to London, determined to rebuild his life. He found work in various clerical jobs, blending into society as just another unremarkable office worker. To the outside world, Graham appeared ordinary, quiet, polite, and inoffensive. But beneath this facade, he was continuing his most sinister experiment, poisoning those around him. His desire to test his power over life and death hadn't diminished in the slightest. It had only grown stronger. In his new jobs, Graham began targeting his coworkers, poisoning them with thallium, a highly toxic substance that he had become increasingly skilled at using. Thallium was a slow-acting poison, and its symptoms were easily mistaken for other illnesses, which allowed Graham to poison people without raising suspicion. He carefully selected his victims, often lacing their drinks, particularly cups of tea, with the deadly substance. Thallium's effects were subtle at first, but devastating in the long run. Victims would experience nausea, vomiting, and fatigue, symptoms that could easily be brushed off as a common flu or food poisoning. However, as the poison worked its way through their bodies, more serious side effects began to manifest, including severe hair loss, muscle weakness, and neurological damage. The real horror of thallium poisoning lay in its gradual progression. Unlike more immediate forms of poisoning, thallium didn't strike all at once. Instead, it crept into the victim system, causing a slow, painful decline that often led to permanent disability or, in some cases, death. For Graham, this slow destruction was the perfect way to exert control over his victims. He could inflict suffering over an extended period while remaining hidden in plain sight. Over the course of 2 years, Graham poisoned at least 70 people. Many of these victims suffered long-term health consequences, including permanent nerve damage and hair loss. Yet, due to the ambiguous nature of thallium poisoning, the true cause was never suspected. At first, co-workers and even doctors couldn't identify the poison as the culprit. Instead, the illnesses were chalked up to bad luck or coincidental sicknesses. Graham's quiet demeanor and lack of a criminal record helped him maintain his cover, making it nearly impossible for anyone to connect him to the wave of mysterious illnesses that seemed to strike the people around him. What was most chilling about Graham's spree was the sheer number of victims he managed to harm without detection. His victims, most of whom never realized they were under attack, were merely pawns in his twisted game. To Graham, they were not people, but subjects of his ongoing methodical experiment. And as the number of his poisoned co-workers continued to rise, he grew more confident in his ability to manipulate his environment, confident that he could get away with murder once again. As Graham Young continued his spree of poisoning, the increasing number of illnesses among his colleagues began to raise eyebrows. What initially seemed like a series of isolated incidents soon started to look more suspicious. Several workers at the office had fallen ill, some with symptoms that seemed to mirror each other: nausea, vomiting, and extreme fatigue. At first, the company brushed off these illnesses as coincidental, but it became increasingly difficult to ignore the pattern. The situation reached a boiling point when Dorothy, one of Graham's co-workers, tragically died under mysterious circumstances. Dorothy's sudden death shocked her colleagues, but it was the circumstances surrounding her illness that made it particularly strange. She had been a perfectly healthy woman before falling ill, and her rapid decline made her death all the more suspicious. Doctors were initially baffled, unable to determine the cause of her condition. Her colleagues, however, began to question the strange coincidences. They started to wonder why so many people in the office seemed to be suffering from similar symptoms. Dorothy's death was a turning point. It marked the first time anyone really began to ask the difficult question: could someone be poisoning them? It was then that Christopher Williams, a fellow employee who had witnessed the alarming pattern of sickness, began to connect the dots. Williams had worked with Graham and noticed an unusual pattern that he could no longer ignore. He realized that the people who had fallen ill, including Dorothy, had all come into contact with Graham in one way or another. Their illnesses didn't seem random. They seemed to be systematically affecting those around him. Williams was particularly concerned by how calm and unaffected Graham appeared when others were ill. His behavior struck Williams as odd, given the gravity of the situation. Most people would be concerned or at least appear uncomfortable, but Graham seemed indifferent. Williams' suspicions grew stronger when he started to notice other unsettling details. He observed that, in the midst of all the illnesses, Graham had a strange fascination with the health of his coworkers. He would ask probing questions about their symptoms, yet his interest never seemed to stem from concern. Instead, it felt more like a clinical curiosity. Something about Graham's calmness, combined with his knowledge of the illnesses, made Williams uneasy. He began to feel that Graham's behavior was more than just coincidental. It was calculating. Determined to get to the bottom of his suspicions, Christopher Williams contacted the authorities. What followed was the beginning of a police investigation that would expose Graham's horrific actions. The police quickly discovered that Graham had been the common denominator in many of the cases of illness. Upon searching Graham's belongings, the investigators found traces of thallium, the very same poison that had caused so many of the illnesses. The discovery was a major breakthrough, linking him directly to the poisonings. This was the moment that finally confirmed Williams' suspicions. Graham Young, the quiet, unassuming office worker, was behind the mysterious illnesses. The police now had enough evidence to arrest him. What had once seemed like a series of random events was now a calculated spree of poisonings, and the true extent of Graham's actions began to unfold. The authorities soon discovered that he had poisoned at least 70 people over the course of 2 years, and many of them had suffered long-term consequences. The investigation had uncovered a chilling truth. Graham had been methodically and silently poisoning those around him, using thallium as his weapon of choice, all while hiding in plain sight. In 1972, Graham Young's trial captivated the nation. His case had become one of the most high-profile criminal cases in Britain, largely because of the shocking nature of his crimes and the chilling realization that he had poisoned dozens of people without detection. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Traces of thallium were found in his possession, and forensic experts confirmed that his victims had been systematically poisoned. The public was stunned by the sheer audacity and coldness of his actions. How a quiet office worker had been able to carry out such a calculated and methodical killing spree, targeting those around him without any apparent remorse. As the trial unfolded, Graham's demeanor in the courtroom shocked everyone who watched. His lack of emotion was striking. He didn't seem to acknowledge the pain and suffering he had caused. Instead, he remained calm and detached, almost as if the proceedings were a mere formality. When given the opportunity to speak in his defense, Graham did not express any regret or sorrow for the lives he had ruined. Instead, he claimed that his poisonings had been part of his experiments, as if his victims were mere subjects in a twisted scientific study. He argued that he never intended to kill anyone, suggesting that he had been testing the effects of poison in a clinical manner. Despite his attempt to justify his actions as harmless experiments, the jury was not swayed. The evidence painted a clear and damning picture of a man who had deliberately harmed and killed without conscience. His defense lacked credibility, and the jurors found it impossible to believe that his actions were anything but intentional. Graham's cold and calculating nature had been laid bare for all to see, and there was little doubt in the minds of those who heard the evidence that he was a dangerous individual, fully aware of the harm he was causing. The verdict was swift and decisive. Graham Young was convicted of 2 murders and several counts of attempted murder. He was sentenced to life in prison, a decision that would ensure he would never harm anyone again. However, his sentence did little to ease the public's fear and the lingering questions about how such a young and seemingly ordinary man could carry out such horrors. For the victims and their families, justice had been served, but the scars left by Graham's poisoning spree would last a lifetime. His conviction marked the end of one chapter of his twisted journey, but the legacy of his crimes would continue to haunt the nation for years to come. The aftermath of Graham Young's poisonings left a deep and lasting impact, particularly on the families of his victims. While the trial brought some measure of justice, the psychological and physical scars endured by those affected could not be erased. Many of the survivors of his poisonings faced long-term health consequences from thallium exposure, including nerve damage, permanent hair loss, and chronic fatigue. For some, the physical toll was accompanied by ongoing emotional trauma, as they realized the betrayal from someone they had worked with, trusted, and considered a colleague. Families and friends of those affected were left to grapple with the horror that Graham's quiet demeanor had concealed such evil intentions. The realization that their loved ones had been silently poisoned by a person they had no reason to suspect created an additional layer of pain, as they struggled with feelings of violation and disbelief. The psychological toll was equally devastating. Victims who survived often struggled with feelings of guilt, wondering why they hadn't noticed the warning signs. For the families of those who did not survive, the trauma was compounded by the sense of helplessness and the devastating loss of life. The sense of betrayal and the brutal realization that such a subtle, insidious form of violence had taken place right under their noses haunted them for years. Graham Young's psychological profile was key to understanding his actions. His obsession with poisons went far beyond simple curiosity. It was an all-consuming need to experiment, to control, and to test the limits of his power. His complete lack of empathy made him a true psychopath, someone who could cause immense suffering without any emotional connection to the pain he inflicted. His ability to mask his true nature behind a facade of normalcy only made his actions more chilling. He did not experience remorse for his poisonings. Instead, he saw his victims as subjects in a twisted experiment, and their suffering only seemed to fuel his obsession. This detachment from human emotions and the deep pleasure he found in causing harm marked him as a dangerous individual from the very beginning. The broader impact of Graham Young's case extended beyond his personal psyche. It raised serious questions about the effectiveness of the psychiatric system. Despite his documented history of violent tendencies and lack of empathy, Graham was released from Broadmoor at the age of 23, a decision that would prove disastrous. His case highlighted significant flaws in how psychiatric evaluations were conducted and the danger of underestimating the capacity for harm in individuals who appeared outwardly calm and rational. The failure of the system to properly assess his continued threat allowed him to re-enter society, where he resumed his dangerous behavior without any real consequence. In the end, Graham's release and subsequent actions exposed a crucial oversight in the handling of psychiatric offenders, one that would influence future discussions on the treatment and monitoring of individuals with violent tendencies. Graham Young's story is a haunting reminder of the dangers posed by untreated psychopathy and the failure of the psychiatric system to adequately assess and manage dangerous individuals. His chilling fascination with poisons, combined with his complete lack of empathy for his victims, paints a stark picture of a man whose obsession with control led to murder. The fact that he was released from Broadmoor despite his documented violent tendencies highlights the catastrophic flaws in the system at the time. His subsequent poisoning spree, leading to the suffering of dozens, demonstrates the tragic consequences of underestimating the potential for harm in those deemed rehabilitated. The case of Graham Young has left a lasting impact on criminal psychology and the handling of psychiatric offenders. It forced a reckoning with how individuals with violent histories should be monitored and treated, especially when their crimes involve cold, methodical manipulation of others. His case has prompted a reevaluation of how we assess individuals in psychiatric facilities and the need for thorough, ongoing evaluations for those with dangerous tendencies. Unfortunately, for his victims and their families, the system's failure to intervene in time meant that they had to live with the repercussions of his unchecked violence. Reflecting on Graham's story raises important questions about justice and the limits of rehabilitation. Should someone who commits such horrific acts at a young age be allowed to re-enter society? How can we ensure that individuals who pose a danger to others are properly monitored? These are questions that still resonate today, particularly as we continue to grapple with the complexities of criminal justice and mental health. Now, I want to hear from you. What do you think? Do you believe Graham Young should have been released from Broadmoor? How do you think the justice system failed to stop him from committing more murders? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your perspective on this chilling case and the broader implications it has on criminal justice and psychiatric care. What are your thoughts on Graham Young's release from Broadmoor? Do you think the system failed to prevent more deaths? Share your opinion in the comments below. If you found this story chilling, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more true crime stories. Your support helps the channel grow, and I appreciate you being part of this journey. Thank you for watching.